Hi class! Today we are going to talk about survey research and sampling procedures. Sampling procedures can be applied to that particular methodological approach, but it can also be applied to both qualitative and quantitative methods. Survey research typically focuses on the measurement of attitudes and opinions. So if your particular topic of interest centers on those particular issues or characteristics, then survey research may be the best. So survey research, what's it good for? It's a questionnaire, most oftentimes. It's a questionnaire, it is a questionnaire, to ask people to provide information about themselves. So you're asking me to provide this particular information, and you're also assuming that I'm answering this particular survey in a very honest and to the best of my ability, an accurate way. So it deals with attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, multiple things. Just try to be clear as to whether it does focus on attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. I see a lot of scales that mix all of those things together. Okay. Definition. So first we're going to focus on sampling, and then we're going to get into questionnaire design and other aspects of survey research. So you want to, first of all, it's important to understand how to identify a sample and how to collect a sample, because the sample represents your population, and if you did not collect the sample in a very thoughtful way, the information that you collect cannot be generalized to the population. So all of your efforts were actually worth nothing. The information you got is pretty much worth nothing. So you really want to be thoughtful in, first of all, identifying and thinking about who is your sample target. You usually don't target the entire population. You usually maybe target a county or a list of volunteers, or you target a particular group. If you're going to target a particular age, or you might target people who are active or not active. So be very thoughtful in the identification of your sample and why you chose that particular sample. You'll see oftentimes in the methods section, so you'll usually see sample and then a bunch of descriptives about that particular sample. But then under that, you usually find the sampling procedure. So the sampling procedure is simply a defense of the sample selection process and its representativeness. And a sampling error is how far off your sample is from that particular population. A population is basically a study on the entire population. It's a census. So why don't we do more censuses? Just because it's oftentimes almost impossible to reach the entire population. It's not efficient. It costs a lot of money. And the whole point is we're supposed to be making progress toward knowledge. And if we spend our time trying to get all these people to respond to our survey, we know that that's probably not going to be the case. But there are some cases, especially in content analysis research, you can actually get the entire population. A few other terms. You're learning that we speak in these, we have specific labels and terms that we used when we talk about social science research. So you might want to know, what is a sampling frame? A sampling frame is simply your list, your entire list. So if you were going to, I see a lot of things, especially with the public relations Society of America, I believe it is. A lot of studies will use their member list and they'll send out a survey to that particular list. But you perhaps might only want to choose a random sample of that particular list. So your sampling frame is, where did you get your list? How did you identify your people? And the unit of analysis is just basically each thing, what all the data represents. So unit of analysis could be an article, it could be a individual, it could be a couple, it could be a comment thread adjacent to an article. So just, you have to be aware and think about what is your unit of analysis. And so oftentimes you'll see scholars will clearly communicate what their unit of analysis is. Other times, not so much. So sample size is a question that I get a lot. I don't go into great detail in this class about sample size, but I do like to highlight general rules of thumb, because in other classes you may be doing survey research or content analysis research, or other types of research. In quantitative research, most often you want kind of a sample size of around 400. So you basically need 400 people to be pretty confident in your results. That's just to give you some guidance in future research projects of what the ideal, this is not the ideal sample size, but what a sufficient sample size is. So steps in the sampling process involve, first of all, you have to identify what is your population. It just can't be just anybody. I mean, there's got to be some thought behind it. And then you want to find a sampling frame or create it yourself that represents that population. And then after you have this list, then you randomly draw from that list, or you use the entire list, depending on whether, depending on what approach you go in the sampling process. Okay. So there are two types of sampling procedures: probability and non-probability. There are benefits and drawbacks to both, but statistics usually should be applied to probability samples, and that's the type of samples we should strive to reach. So, but the thing with probability samples is that the population is known. So you have to know that particular population. So for example, I did a study on social media communicators. I didn't know the entire population of all social media communicators in the United States. So there are times when you're not going to know the entire population. But the intent is that you want to avoid researchers' conscious or unconscious biases, because all elements, all people should have an equal chance of being selected. Statistical analysis rests on the idea of normal distribution. We're not talking about it in this particular class, but basically each element has a known probability of being sampled. So there are strategies that researchers use in order to ensure the validity of their findings. And so obviously this is one particular approach, and random is a very important approach as well. So you randomly select the news articles for your analysis. You randomly select the people that are going from that particular list, because I don't want my biases to have an influence in who's selected. So there are a lot of selection, but sampling essentially protects us from our biases and ensures our statistical results are accurate. Samples should, as best as possible, reflect the population. That's really what you're striving to do, is to the best of your ability to accurately reflect the whole population. When members are given no chance of being selected, then we have some problems. So, for example, if you select people on the street, there's some bias involved. You may not think that there is, but there is bias involved. So just be really aware of your selection biases, and that's what we are essentially trying to protect against. There are various types of probability samples, and I'll go over those briefly. But these are the four that I will be doing. So once your sampling frame is established, or your list is created, then you go about selecting that sample to represent the entire population. But there are different strategies depending on your research goals. So the simplest, of course, is simple random sample. So you could put a bunch of pieces of paper in a bag, and you could shake it up, and you could reach your hand in and take the person's name. So it's pretty simple. It's not too bad. And the same thing goes, you could take an entire list, assign everyone a particular number, and then find a random number generator to pick those individuals. So each person has a chance of being selected. Systematic sampling, this is often, it falls prey to the order of the list, but you could select every 10th person on that list. You could select every 3rd person on that particular list. This is often used when you have to, the person has to keep the names confidential. So if you, for example, wanted to interview people at a health clinic, they're not going to give you that list. But what they might do is you might instruct the person working at the clinic just randomly select a number to start with, and then pick every 6th person from that particular starting point. So that's what really a systematic sampling is all about. It's pretty simple, and it has, its behavior does represent simple random sampling. Okay. The next is stratified random sampling. This requires information about the population being sampled, but essentially what you do is you break the population into stratas. So, for example, if there's a group that from the random sampling process that might not be picked, you might want to put that group aside and randomly select from that particular group, just to ensure that their opinions or their voices are represented in the results. So it could be dealing with race. There are some races that are less prevalent than other. It could be gender. It could be income, education level. It could be location. You might want to ensure rural people are represented in your survey. So you basically group people into stratas. But it's critical to understand that people can only be placed in one strata. So it has to be mutually exclusive. Okay? The next and the last is cluster sampling. And so basically you randomly select clusters. So you might randomly select a household and interview the entire household. You may randomly select 5 tables at a cafeteria, and then you interview every person sitting at these 5 tables. So that's pretty much the thought process behind it. So to avoid order bias, that's really important. So you might not want an alphabetical list because that might have some sort of bias to it. So just make sure that each person has a chance of being selected. And just assign each person a number by their name. Okay, the other type which is very prevalent in the social sciences, is non-probability sampling. These are essentially samples of convenience, and the members are easily accessible. So it's very common because we have difficulty. We don't often know the population that's of interest for our study. So one particular procedure, non-probability procedure, is snowball sampling. You often don't see snowball sampling in most research in social sciences, but it is defensible in certain cases. So, for example, you may want to interview people who would not openly share their background. So perhaps people who work in prostitution. So you would say, okay, you found one person, you might ask them who they know who you could interview. So clearly it's just you reach those few people and ask them for recommendations so you can access this hard to reach group. And that's what a snowball sample is. And this is what we mostly see. Purposive sample. Basically, that's a particular group, and it's based on the researcher's judgment about which people are the most useful or most representative. You don't often know much about the population they represent, and so you might do local council people, community leaders, local food groups, something like that. So it's a very specific group of people that you want to understand more about. So there are 2 types of surveys, study designs. Almost, I don't have a statistic, but I would guess almost all almost all survey research that you find published in research journals or published in reports is what's referred to as cross-sectional. It means it's just a snapshot. The study, you study them at one point and one time. You don't study them over a period of time, collecting data over a period of time. It's just not something that's done very often. So for the most part, most people employ cross-sectional research. Okay, this is an important figure to present as well. That's the response rate. So you have your list. What percentage of those people responded to your survey? And so we have two things, response rate and completion rate. Completion rate is how many people actually completed all the questions of your survey. And response rate is how many people responded to your survey. You will find oftentimes that people drop off. If you have cases or individuals where they clearly abandon the survey, you have to delete those cases and you cannot include them in your response rate. So what can we do to get people to respond? Most oftentimes, it's people who are interested in that particular project or the information stemming from that research project. So when you send out email invitations, try to frame it in a way that would intrigue them to encourage them to respond to surveys. People who like participating in this sorts of research, you have to make sure people are scared that their identity is going to be associated with their answers. You have to assure them confidentiality. And of course, most survey research involves multiple invitations because oftentimes people will forget, or they just, they'll say they'll do it later and they don't. So oftentimes most people will just simply not respond in survey research. And that's the biggest challenge that you will face in survey research, is people simply don't want to participate. But you need this information. So you have to get good at figuring out ways to encourage people to respond to your surveys. There's a book, and it's called basically the Dillman Tailored Survey Method. He argues that his approach is one of the best approaches to securing responses for surveys. And what he argues is that you need to have a pre-notice notification, like letting them know that they'll be receiving a survey shortly. I've tested that, and in email surveys it doesn't work so well because people will be like, where's the link? So for me personally, the pre-notice works, I believe, better with mail, but maybe not to such a great degree with online surveys. It's always important to have a welcome message or cover letter, a consent information sheet, which you do through IRB. Usually if you conduct a survey and you want to publish the results, you have to get IRB approval. He also talks about recruitment and ways to increase response rates. I've done several different things, cash incentives, gift cards, follow-ups, sharing the published study when I'm done. That works really well because people are really interested in those results. So now you got to figure out what questions you want on the survey. I'm going to emphasize this again. Do not simply make up your own questions. If a scale exists measuring that particular concept of interest. So just know that many very abstract concepts might have multiple sets of scales or multiple dimensions. And so you can see this is the case here with like poverty. There are two types of poverty and sets of questions that measure each type of poverty. So, and each indicator is one single question. I provided examples for you so that way you can get an idea of what I'm referring to on our site. Respondents have to have explicit options from which to choose from. We care about numbers, In quantitative, we mostly deal with close-ended questions because people do not want to respond to open-ended questions, and if they do, I might put one open-ended question. That's very rare that I do that, just because already it takes a lot to get people to answer the close-ended questions. So just keep that in mind when you are doing that. So I'll talk a little bit about levels of measurement. In this, I teach a quantitative research methods class. In that class, it's critical to learn levels of measurement because that influences what statistics can be applied. The highest level of measurement means that you could apply the greatest number of statistics to that particular analysis. So remember, we're interested in predicting variation, how one variable predicts variations in another variable. If you have greater variation, you can do more with it. The types of questions that involve lower levels of measurement, you have a lot less you can do with that. So this is just to give you an idea of those 4 levels of measurement that you should have learned in any basic research methods course. So Stevens developed the levels of measurement, and again, they affect what statistics you can use. And the mathematical precision with which the variables can be expressed. The higher level, the more mathematical precision. And so these are the 4 I'm going to talk about. And then you're going to have to decide which questions, and then ideally you would know what level of measurement each of those questions are at. Okay, so nominal, that's the lowest level. Nominal has no mathematical interpretation. So a person may be maybe a truck driver or a doctor, but he or she does not represent 3 units more occupation than the other. Gender is most often an example of a dichotomous variable. It only has 2 values. So male, female, you could assign that the numbers 1, 2 or 0, 1. A quiet room, college major. Each major could be assigned a particular number. With each number, it wouldn't matter at all the assignment of each number as well. So, kind of. But anyway, that's what nominal is. It's also important that every case can only have one attribute and they cannot overlap. We see nominal level variables most often in content analysis research. So in content analysis, you see a lot of statistics associated with nominal level variables. Mutually exclusive means that the categories must be distinct enough that no observations will fall into more than one category. So it's a coin toss. It's either heads or tails. For example, you have to say select one of these categories, not all of these categories, because it's very difficult to do analysis when you give them multiple options. Because remember, we're all about numbers. So you might ask someone's marital status, and there are a lot of options for that. It could be common law marriage, religious marriage, legally married, living together, divorced, never married, informally separated, legally separated, widowed, annulled. So there are a lot of different options, but you have to decide which options that you want. And if you do these type of analysis, it's often important to include the other option. So for instance, if you're coding news articles, sometimes the article does not fall under one of the 4 categories you provided. So then you provide an other option. Alright, so perhaps something like social media channel usage. You have Facebook, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, but then a few people might still use MySpace, so that might be your other category. Okay. Ordinal, rank ordered points on a scale. Basically, it allows the researcher to kind of assess like ranking. So you might ask a respondent to rank their favorite video games. And so they will give each number a ranking, and then you can compare respondents' ranking and attributes of them. So that might be one particular approach to ranking. It also means that the intervals between the measures, between the options or responses, is not even. So you can see did not use 1 time per year, 1 time a month, 2 times per month. It's not really even distance between each of those options, okay? Interval, you can add or subtract, but there is no 0 point. So most scholars treat strongly agree to strongly disagree scales as Likert. They often range from 1 to 5 points, 1 to 7 points, some 9 points. You have more variation, the more points, but then oftentimes people cannot distinguish between each of those points if you continue to add too many points. So here's some common types of interval scales. Likert measures attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. I provided an example on the site that gives you example Likert type options that as far as responses are concerned. So how much did you agree with this statement? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then semantic deferential scales. These are often used in advertising research where people rate their reaction to some sort of stimuli. So rate from 1 to 7, good, was it the ad good or bad? So that's usually where you see the semantic differential scales. So it's really critical when you use these scales to not use jargon. So let's see, what's an example? You could use, instead of extroverted, introverted, you could use talkative and quiet. And that's an example. So just think about that when you're looking for scales. And so this is an example of a Likert type scale. It's the Core Alcohol and Drug Survey. And then we have the highest ratio. And you can divide and multiply. It's more precise, but also have to think of the response. So basically, how much do you weigh? Well, that's really not. How much does this object weigh? It could be less than 0. It could be 3 pounds. It could be 5 pounds. It could be 20 pounds. How many official sources were in the news article? There could be 0 or there could be 13 official news sources. So that's usually ratio type measures, but they can be somewhat hard to, especially in content analysis research, to code because it's sometimes hard to count each individual time that particular official source appears versus just simply doing an absence-presence measure. Did this story include an official source? Yes, no. So that would be a 0, 1. Okay, questionnaire development. It's really important that the first set of questions represent what the focus of the study is. So if you spin that this study is about this specific subject, and then their first set of questions don't relate to that subject, it oftentimes irritates people and they abandon the survey. So when you're adjusting and thinking about the flow of your survey, really thoughtfully think about question order. The most important concepts should be toward the top, because remember, a lot of times people will just abandon the middle of the survey. So we want to make sure that those most important sets of questions are first. This is an example of a matrix, and oftentimes you put a scale in a matrix. You want to group like items together, keep questions and context together, communicate the value of the survey to encourage people to respond. I tend to put my demographics toward the end unless it's a really essential demographic question. And I tend to order it in, I try to really put myself in the headspace of a participant related to this, related to my research interests. So think about that when you're designing it. If you were this participant, what would be the best flow? If you were this participant, which would be the least irritating order? And I'm going to look at the flow of your questionnaire to see that. And then you might want to refine your questionnaire. It's always good to take that questionnaire. A lot of times I'll take a paper copy and I'll give it to other scholars, or I'll give it to, and I oftentimes give it to participants to give me feedback. And I always, very rarely do I not change my questionnaire, because that feedback is so critical, because I can only do so much. So it's really helpful to get feedback. And there are different ways to get feedback. You could do focus groups. You could have expert feedback, such as the survey participant, a scholar on that particular topic area, and then a methodologist. You could do pre-tests and pilot tests. So you could have a group of several individuals give you feedback, or you could actually administer the survey to see how the data fall through a pilot test. Cognitive interviews, you just simply have them to read the questions and tell me what they're, and ask them to tell you what they're thinking as they read those questions, okay? You want to make sure, what you're going to find is that when you're looking at scales, a lot of times the questions within these scales seem somewhat redundant. And so that oftentimes irritates participants, but you need to not alter or modify the scale unless you have some logic behind your modification. And just remember other things, perhaps the time that you send out the survey, the validity of your questions. We have things such as social desirability. I mean, think about those surveys that you get. Oftentimes you hope that the results go in a certain direction. And when it comes to certain values type questions, people tend to respond as how they would like to be seen rather than how they actually are. So just FYI, it's also tough to recall people, recall the last time, recall how many times do you check Facebook in a week? For some people that number would be impossible to recall. So you might ask them questions that are easier to recall. I'm down with you guys putting your own questions on the survey, but most questions should be rooted in other people's work. Because remember, the whole point is to build on the scholarship that exists and use these valid scales that have been proven reliable over time. Okay, so just when you're doing your survey, please don't put all the questions that you could think of. Think about what your objectives are and which questions are critical. Oftentimes I will go and delete a quarter to a third of my survey just because I know survey length affects my response and completion rate. Don't be abusing the participant's time. Don't hint what the survey is about as far as what you hope the results might be. Just try to make sure to not bias the respondent. Be very thoughtful. Ask one question at a time. None of these double-barreled questions. Use simple language. Use concepts instead of prepositions such as, or things that people don't understand. Avoid biased words. Think about the culture of the participants when you are reaching out to them or when you're writing questions and things like that. So these are just a few tips as far as designing your questionnaire and selecting your sample. So I hope that was helpful for you, and I hope you guys have a great day.